the situation on the ground in Ukraine, how much of a difference have NATO weapons meant? And not just during this war itself. I mean, the billions of dollars that have been allocated. I think the figure now officially from Congress is at least $66 billion spent by the US officially on the proxy war in Ukraine. But also the previous 8 years of NATO training Ukrainian soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers in Ukraine trained by the US and NATO allies instead of Ukraine. How much of a difference has all of that made to this current war?
I think it has made a profound difference in some areas and not so much difference in others. Let me give you a quick example. This is something which we did not buy and give to the Ukrainians. It's called Starlink. It's a system that was developed by Elon Musk, and it's satellite based, and it's near instantaneous. You have a dish, satellites keep coming across. You are communicating, planning, coordinating operations on the ground with the use of nonstop satellite-based communications and interaction that allow you to plan and execute operations on the fly. That has helped enormously. And that was provided, as I said, by Elon Musk. The Javelin initially was touted as the wonder weapon, but we know that hundreds of the wonder weapons were actually captured by the Russians. And as soon as the Russians figured out, as frequently happens with a new weapon, what the danger was and how to treat it and how to respond to it, it ceased to be a wonder weapon. In other words, any weapon you implement that's new, there's a very short half-life for that weapon to have an impact, after which the enemy discovers what it is, how to counter it, and moves on. So I think a lot of these weapons have been very good for a short period of time, but they haven't fundamentally changed the strategic equation. And there's only so much that you can train people to do. You know, we've had, 8 years of a steady NATO, primarily US, UK, British, some German, some French, Canadian training. But it starts with a small group, and then you get a larger group, and it continues to grow. By the time the Russians moved in with roughly 150,000 men, of whom 80,000 were combat troops, they faced a force of 600,000 Ukrainians. So the Russians were always outnumbered. But the Ukrainians were also advised to do some things that weren't very smart. One of which was move into these cities and urban areas, immobilize yourself in defense, and fight it out. Well, the problem with that is that your opponent can sit down, light up a camel, take his time, cut you off, cut off your water, cut off your electricity, isolate you, and then grind you down, which is exactly what happened to most of these places. That was not a good strategy. And now that strategy has become fight for every inch of ground, which is another loser historically for any army that tries to do it. Ground is only valuable if it gives you an advantage. It's something you drive over and fly over. It has otherwise no value. So militarily, it has to have a value for you that it gives you an advantage to hold on to it. This is the problem with all these counterattacks. And that's why they're bleeding. So I would say that, yes, there were so many good things. I think in terms of leadership, the Ukrainians have done some very good things. And look, the Ukrainians have always been tough soldiers. This is not a new development. So are the Russians. By the way, the Chechens have been phenomenal in this fight. Absolutely phenomenal, which tracks with the history of Chechens, if you know anything about the Caucasus. The Russians are lucky they're on their side. But the bottom line is that did it change everything? Was it a game changer? No. Because armies are more than just a few years of investment and training. They are institutions. They grow over time. It's like our submarine fleet. The Chinese have tried to field a nuclear submarine fleet. Whenever one of their subs goes to sea, it never goes very far from the coast, and they're afraid they're going to lose it. Well, no surprise. Look how long it took us to build, field, develop, train, educate people to operate nuclear submarines. Decades. So I think you have to scale back your expectations of what military assistance can do. And I think it did many good things, but it was never going to be enough. Is that reasonable?
Absolutely.
Okay. You need to tell me if you want more.
So I want to ask you your thoughts on a tweet that was recently tweeted out by, of all people, Elon Musk. Ukraine-Russia peace. Redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that is will of the people. Crimea formerly part of Russia, as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake. Water supply to Crimea assured. Ukraine remains neutral. And of course, he's been very attacked over this. But what are your thoughts on that plan?
Well, I think it's a reasonable plan, but we're not dealing with reasonable people. And the Ukrainians weren't willing to do any of that long before the war began. Remember, the two so-called breakaway autonomous republics, the people there are Russians, just as the people in Kherson are Russians. But Putin and the Russian government never demanded that those people join Russia. The Minsk Accords was his attempt to avoid a war. And remember, those were signed by Macron and Scholz and others, and they promised to implement them. They were never implemented. And what he wanted them to do was treat the Russians living on Ukrainian soil as equals. Allow them to be equal to other citizens, equal before the law. Allow them to speak their language, educate their children in Russian, open and maintain their churches. That's what he wanted. And that was unacceptable to Zelensky and the crew that was installed in 2014. I don't think Zelensky ever was. I'm still not entirely sure how Kolomoisky and George Soros and Victoria Nuland discovered him and put him in power. That's another story. But I think the radical nationalists and those people are the people you referred to earlier as neo-Nazis. That's accurate. They were the ones that said, if you don't want to be a Ukrainian, you can leave. Your only alternative is to, quote unquote, Ukrainianize, whereas give up your identity, your culture, your language, your schools, your church, and become one of us. And of course, in that part of the world, those things don't happen. I mean, this is the problem with denationalization. Race, religion, language, and culture are part of what makes us human beings. We are not just economic animals. We're not all Pavlovian dogs. Feed us and we're happy. There's more to us than that. And he was demanding that all of that be flushed and you become members of the new Ukrainian state. The second part is that almost as soon as he took over, the Ukrainian forces began attacking the autonomous republics, shelling these places, killing people, large numbers of civilians that had nothing to do with anything. And no one did anything about it, even though Putin kept saying they must implement the accords. And Ukrainians kept saying, you have to send us the taxes that you collect from the people in those republics. Well, the Russians said, well, then if we pay you taxes, which we're not collecting, by the way, because these people are at war under shell fire, but then we're paying you, who's going to pay for their homes, their schooling, their medical care, their sewage, roads, bridges? And of course, the answer was, that's not our problem. So there was never a willingness on the Ukrainian side to implement these accords. And Putin made that very clear. He told us that, and we didn't care because apparently we wanted the confrontation. When I say we, the people in power in Washington. And the same people today who went in and told Donald Trump, you have to give us this, you have to support us with this. If you want us to do X, Y, and Z in support of your agenda, you have to help us in Ukraine. And he finally buckled under pressure and went along with it. Those people are still out there right now arguing for a fight to the death, to the last Ukrainian to defeat Russia. They're there. They haven't gone anywhere. And that's why we don't talk about Republicans and Democrats much anymore. We talk about the uniparty. Who are we kidding? I grew up with Democrats. I'm from Philadelphia. Democrats I grew up with were great people, great Americans. They would never sign on for any of this. I don't know what they're talking about. So I don't think it's Democrats and Republicans anymore. I think it is this uniparty that is enriching itself on a scale that I don't think we've ever seen in American history. I mean, how did Liz Cheney go from being worth $7 billion to being worth over $40 million in the space of 2 terms, or what is it, 3 terms, 6 years? It's insane. I mean, how is that possible? Well, we know how it's possible. The system doesn't work. It's corrupt.
Doug, after this proxy war is over, we can debate just how involved George Soros has been in all of this. Although, I will concede that he has spent a lot of money on efforts to bring Ukraine into the pro-Western camp. I just don't know how involved he was in bringing Zelensky to power. But we can leave that aside. But I do want to ask you, you mentioned how there are just forces inside Ukraine who just don't see the Russian-speaking population as equal. And, a major force that represents this is, of course, the Azov Battalion, which for years it's been openly acknowledged. You can read about it in the New York Times that they're openly neo-Nazi. Congress in 2018 banned any U.S. assistance to Azov. But all of a sudden, since the February invasion, it's like all that recent history is forgotten. And now in the New York Times, you'll see headlines like this one, which talks about commanders of Azov who were freed under a prisoner swap having an emotional reunion with their families, and no mention at all anymore in the Times of what they used to report, that Azov is neo-Nazi. And I'm just wondering your response to all that, seeing just the contrast before the invasion and afterward, how the U.S. has treated a neo-Nazi paramilitary group that it once banned assistance to.
Well, Kolomoisky, who is the billionaire oligarch who's most responsible for our friend Zelensky's emergence from obscurity, is Jewish. He is the number one funder of all the neo-Nazi organizations and formations. Makes no sense to me. I can't conceive of that, frankly, but that's the case. I think that at this stage, if the globalists want to win, they'll use anything and anyone to win. That includes neo-Nazis. It includes blowing up pipelines. It includes sanctions. It includes anything that they can find. No stone will be left unturned. And by the way, you mentioned Soros.
Well, you mentioned Soros,
there are people telling me that he's practically the shadow NSA. That may well be the case. He's a violent Putin hater. And of course, just as he is persona non grata in Russia, he's also persona non grata in Israel because he's a well-known Israel hater. So it's a very strange set of circumstances for which there is no easy explanation. But war is like that. You end up with partners you never thought you'd have and enemies that you never thought you'd have. And that's where we are right now. So if you're again, I just set rationality aside because I don't think it has much impact anymore.
Shifting gears a little bit, the New York Times has an article. It says, U.S. aims to turn Taiwan into giant weapons depot. Officials say Taiwan needs to become a quote-unquote porcupine with enough weapons to hold out if the Chinese military blockades and invades it, even if Washington decides to send troops. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the supposition is that Taiwan is an inevitable target for the Chinese, that China will invade Taiwan, that China has always wanted to invade Taiwan. I don't think that those things are true. If you go back to Xi's statements at various party congresses, the idea was that the two states would grow together. In other words, over time, whatever was different about them would be set aside. They would grow together. And they envisioned, as I recollect, unification between Taiwan and China sometime around 2040. That doesn't sound to me like a plan to invade. The second thing is that if you look at the PLA doesn't have the transport to move tens of thousands of soldiers over 100 miles of water to reach Taiwan. We know how difficult it is just across the English Channel, which is considerably narrower. What are we thinking? I mean, crossing 100 miles of water to mount a major invasion is very difficult. Then the third thing is that the Chinese do a land office business with Taiwan, and most of the Taiwan banks have vast quantities of their money on the mainland. I don't see much appetite in Taiwan for war with China. In fact, every time we sail ships through the Straits of Taiwan, the Taiwan military has asked us to, will you please stop doing that? Because every time you do that, we have to contend with some angry PLA statement and an overflight from PLA jets. It doesn't sound to me as though they're particularly worried or afraid at this stage. And then finally, remember this. Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces. All the major invasions of southern China through Shanghai and elsewhere were launched from troops brought from Japan to assemble on Taiwan that then invaded China. China will never tolerate foreign forces in control of Taiwan. The Japanese know that and will never send Japanese forces there, even though they're very friendly with and do a land office business with Taiwan. Both China, South Korea, and Japan are all dependent upon the microchip industry in Taiwan. It's a known fact. To a large extent, so are we. No one wants to interrupt that. No one wants to destroy that manufacturing base. So the question is, what could trigger a war? What would provoke China to take action? And that's very easy to explain. The presence of U.S. forces in strength on Taiwan. Because their assumption is, if we bring forces, we plan to invade. And if we put missiles there, it's over. Then China will level Taiwan if it has to, thinking that if they do not, they will be the victims of the United States as they were of Imperial Japan. And you have a similar obsession down in the South China Sea. The South China Sea was controlled for hundreds of years by the Royal Navy. They're not very happy to see the United States Navy control it, and they fear a potential blockade. And we're aggressive and hostile towards them. These so-called freedom of navigation operations, we're supposed to turn off all our radars. We're supposed to unload all of our guns. We frequently go blazing through there without doing those things. So, the question is, who's provocative here? And the Chinese have never stopped a commercial vessel, any, because the Chinese are desperately dependent upon the Strait of Malacca. Why would they blockade it? Why would they stop commerce? And doesn't anyone think that the Vietnamese would be very sensitive to all of this? And by the way, Vietnam has actually fortified and occupied more sandbars and turned them into islands than the PLA has from China. And guess what? Taiwan and mainland China both unanimously agree on all of the claims that are made by Beijing on territory and waters in the South China Sea. So for some reason, we're content to let our friends in Taiwan make outrageous claims, but China has to be punished and defeated militarily for making the same ones. Has it not occurred to anyone that this is another regional matter that really doesn't concern us as long as commerce flows? What interest do we have in the South China Sea? Do we want the oil and gas or the mineral wealth? Not particularly. I mean, if they invite our oil companies in there, they'll be happy to drill for them and charge them accordingly. But the point is, our only real interest in the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca is the same: commerce. We just want to be able to use it, get through it. Everybody does. So there's no evidence that China wants to stop that. So I am baffled by all of that. Now, if you want to turn around and start talking about other things we don't like about the Chinese, well, we can spend hours talking about that. But the solution to the things we don't like is not necessarily a war.